go on the record. This is the Clermont County Board of Revision. It's October 21st, 2021. We're here for the 9:30 a.m. case number 2020-787. We'll begin by introducing ourselves for the record, beginning to my left.
Jennifer Haley, representing Commissioner Bonnie Baxter.
Jeannie Zermeling, County Treasurer.
Linda Fraley, County Auditor.
Phil Brown, Auditor's Office, Real Estate Department.
Chrissy Broussard, Auditor's Office, Real Estate Department. Teresa Mahon, Commercial Assessor for the Auditor's Office.
David Nunzio, Attorney for the New Richmond Schools.
And on Zoom,
Thank you. That may please the board. My name is Carrie Bowers, and I'm the attorney for the property owner. With me today are representatives both of the property owner as well as our appraiser, Kevin Rock.
And I'm Richard Hoffman, an appraiser for the Clermont County Auditor.
Chrissy is in person with you also on Zoom. Yourself, Kevin.
And Emily, if you could identify yourself for the record, please, as well.
Sure. Emily O'Brien, I'm with Vistra. And I'm Deb Story, I'm with ARC.
We have a Connie Ivins.
Yes, I'm here. This is Connie Evans, and I'm with Vistra Energy, or Vistra Corp, sorry.
Okay. Thank you all. Mr. Brown, would you put this case on the record, please?
This is case 2020-787. Property owner Energy Zimmer LLC filed the original complaint. There are 6 parcels involved. The parcels are 450807.001, 222616F049, 222616F050, 222616F052, 450807.014, 443303A005. The combined opinion of value is $40 million. The auditors, the New Richmond School District filed a counter complaint suggesting that the auditor's value remain unchanged at a combined value of $140,277,400.
For clarification for myself and possibly others, we're going to hear all 6 cases, or are we hearing each one individually?
No, it's all as one.
Okay, so we're hearing case 2020-787 through 792.
Correct.
Okay, just want to clarify that for the record. Okay, before we begin, I'd like to swear in anybody that is not an attorney who will be giving testimony today. So anyone on Zoom that's not an attorney, please raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
I do.
Thank you. So, Ms. Bauerschmidt, you filed this complaint on behalf of your client, is that correct? I'll turn it over to you.
That is correct. And does the board have before it the appraisal that Kevin Riley has prepared on the subject property?
I believe we do here on, yes, we do have it electronically.
Thank you very much. First of all, Emily, if you could tell the board what your relationship is to the subject property.
Sure, I'm the Associate General Tax Counsel for Vistra, so I'm responsible for property taxes for the whole fleet, including the Zimmer plant.
And what is Vistra's relationship to this, the W.H. Zimmer power plant?
We are the owners of the power plant.
And if you could just very briefly tell the board a little bit about this particular plant, possibly when your company acquired this property, and as of January 1st, 2020, how this property was being utilized by your company.
Sure. So we acquired this plant in an acquisition. We had Vistra and acquired the Dynegy company, which was a very large generation portfolio. It's about 40,000 megawatts. For reference and comparison, the Zimmer plant itself is 1,300 megawatts. So Dynegy was a very big company with lots of power plants. We acquired that company in April of 2018. As part of that, we also acquired the Zimmer plant. We have been operating it since then, evaluating, whether to continue its operation. January 2020, that was still ongoing. It has pretty much been a constant evaluation since the acquisition. Coal is a challenged fuel type, and coal plants in the PJM market and the nearby MISO market in particular have been challenged. There have been many shutdowns over the past few years. Vistra has not been immune to that. And so in January of 2020, this was a economically challenged coal plant that was being evaluated for shutdown.
You made a comment regarding two markets. If you could explain what you meant by those two markets.
Oh, sure. PJM is the energy market in which the Zimmer plant operates. MISO is the market in Illinois, which is similar and comparable. Those are two pretty economically challenged energy markets, which make it difficult for a competitive generation company to run older technology, less efficient plants like the coal plant, which is the Zimmer plant.
And if you could tell the board, I know that there's different types of utility. There's a regulated utility and a competitive utility company. As of January 1st, 2020, and for this property, are you a regulated utility like one of the former owners was, or are you a competitive utility company?
Vistra is a competitive company. It is an independent power producer, so it's totally competitive in all of its markets. So unlike a...
Okay, I think we're back online. So Ms. Bauerschmidt, if you'd like to back up and go over those questions again, we'll continue.
Thank you very much. Emily, you were discussing the difference of a regulated utility and a competitive utility company. And you were also explaining what your company is. Can you kind of go back and redo that testimony for the board, please?
Sure. So Vistra is a competitive independent power producer, which operates differently from a regulated power producer. A regulated company can recover costs in its rate base from taxpayers. A competitive company like Vistra cannot, which makes it a totally different economic picture in all markets that those companies are operating in.
And what are the challenges that are currently facing, and we're going back obviously to January 1st, 2020, that we're facing coal plants in particular?
Sure. So coal has very much been in decline since about 2012. It has become more expensive to fuel, more expensive to run, more expensive to maintain than the newer technology plants that are available, like combined cycle gas plants, some of the renewables, nuclear plants in some markets are even less expensive to run today than a coal plant. So many coal plants have been retiring over the past few years. It's, like I said, it started in about 2012, the decline with, it was not only more expensive to run all of these, also environmental regulations play a part. There's significant costs associated with compliance with all of the environmental regulations that attach to a coal plant. So demand for coal has also gone down significantly over the last 20 years. So today, there's almost no demand to build a coal plant, run a coal plant. It's very much in a phase out state across the United States. We've had many coal retirements at our company. And when we acquired Zimmer and the other coal plants in the Dynegy portfolio, they were kind of wrapped into the analysis of when to retire. And I would say certainly during our ownership period, Zimmer has been uneconomic and has been on the bubble to watch for when to retire. I think we announced initially in September of 2020 that it would retire no later than 2027, depending on economic conditions. Unfortunately, the economic conditions continue to decline, and so we've announced in July of 2021 that actually that will retire in May of 2022. I think that was everything I talked about.
And what are some of the reasons that went behind, for example, this particular plant, the thoughts of closing it? I know that you talked about it not being economic. Are there any other reasons behind that?
I think that's certainly the main driver. I can't speak to the full analysis. I was not on that team. But certainly it's not a decision that's made over 1 year or even 2 years. It's a long analysis. These are long-lived assets. It's a big impact when they close. They're heavily regulated by state and federal authorities. So it's a very big decision to close a coal plant, and it would have been a very long analysis, years in the making.
And as to this particular property, the fact that it was originally built as a nuclear power plant, and it appears that there's extra buildings that aren't being utilized because of that, is that leading to some of the inefficiencies and unprofitability of this particular property?
I can't speak to that specifically, but certainly there are extra buildings and things that are not utilized on the site, because a nuclear plant is completely different from a coal plant in structure and requirements, obviously safety. So there's lots of things that you need at a nuclear plant that are just totally unnecessary at a coal plant.
I would just put an objection. My understanding is that I don't want to leave the misimpression that this was built completely as a nuclear plant and converted. That's not what happened. It was originally designed to be a nuclear plant, and at some point before it ever opened, they decided to convert. I think 3 Mile Island occurred or something in that interim, and they decided to convert over to a coal plant. But it wasn't like there was this complete nuclear plant. And I agree with, I was going to object until she said she really wasn't familiar. I don't think she's an engineer. I don't think she would really understand what implications it would have. But it was not a complete nuclear plant at the time it was converted.
Go ahead, Ms. Bauerschmidt.
Thank you very much. Is there anything else that you would like to tell the board regarding this particular property from your company point of view?
Yeah, I think the one thing I would like to say is we've had many coal retirements over the past few years, and we have a lot of experience in what the market value for a plant like this is. Specifically, we've had 4 other coal closures in the last 4 years that we have sold to a demolition and remediation company. And in every single case, it has been a negative sales price, which means we, the sellers, have paid a substantial amount of money to the demolition and remediation company to take ownership of the sites. And that's been true across the board, and I certainly believe it to be true in this case as well. If we were to try and sell it, it would be a substantially negative sales price.
Now, you're aware that the Board of Education yesterday submitted a decision and order from an old BTA case on this property where back then the owner was the Cincinnati Gas and Electric Company. Is that particular company, Cincinnati Gas and Electric, and going back to your discussion regarding the different types of ownership. Some are public companies as opposed to your particular property, which is a competitive utility company, not a regulated utility. Do you have any knowledge of whether or not Cincinnati Gas and Electric Company was a competitive utility company such as your company is?
I believe it was owned by Synergy, and I believe they were regulated utilities.
Thank you. That concludes Emily's testimony at this point in time. Do you want her to respond to questions now, or would you like our appraiser to go forward with his testimony?
Mr. DeMuzio prefers to cross-examine now.
I should face this way. The decision to shut down, did you say the original announcement involved a shutdown no later than 2027, is that correct?
Yeah, the statement was no later than 2027 unless economic conditions
I understand.
differ.
When was that announcement made?
I believe it was September of 2020.
Okay, so that was after the valuation date, and then you
That was
said,
a public announcement, correct?
right, and then you said there was another public announcement saying that the companies decided to shut the plant down in May of 23, is that correct?
22.
Oh, I'm sorry, 22. And when was that announcement made?
July of 2021.
Okay. Now, your discussions about other plants, I think you indicated that there have been quite a few shutdowns of coal plants, coal generating electric plants in the last decade or so, is that correct?
Yes.
That would have the effect of reducing competition, if you will. It would have the effect certainly of reducing the supply of electricity, is that correct?
No, I don't think that's necessarily correct.
Well, if a plant produces 1,000 kilowatts and it's suddenly shut down, then there's 1,000 kilowatts less of electric generating capacity in the market, is that correct?
I think that's a pretty oversimplification of the market structure.
All right. Now, Zimmer actually is more efficient than most coal plants, is that correct? It has.
No, I don't think that's correct.
All right. Isn't the largest single component of cost the cost of coal?
No, I don't believe that that's correct.
What do you think the largest cost component is for a electric generating plant?
For a coal plant
Yes.
specifically?
Yes.
I think there's a variety. I think maintenance is up there. I can't speak to the number one, but I know it's maintenance and cost to keep up with all of the regulations are substantial.
Zimmer has a scrubber, doesn't it, that permits it to use low-grade, inexpensive coal, is that correct?
I'm not sure about that. I believe it does have a scrubber, but I think that is more of a pollution control equipment. I don't believe that impacts the cost of the fuel.
All right. If you can use high sulfur coal, which is less expensive than the high grade coal, wouldn't that be a huge reduction in cost if they can use low-cost coal?
I'm not going to get into a discussion of costs at the plant. I can assure you that they've done everything they possibly can to reduce costs. And if there was a way to keep it running efficiently and economically, they would have done so. There's been large initiatives internally to reduce costs. There's been large initiatives to do everything they possibly could to keep these plants open and running. And we're not going to solve that today. And I certainly can't speak to what they could have done.
I'm just talking in terms of their competitive position. You've testified that other plants have shut down. You've testified specifically about Zimmer's struggles to compete. So I think it's a fair question as to how it compares to other coal plants.
Well, I
Are
think
you
I've
saying-
testified specifically to coal's struggle to compete, and Zimmer is a coal plant. That is true.
Now, are you familiar with the price of natural gas the last couple of years, the price of coal the last couple of years?
Yes, I'm familiar.
Isn't it fair to say the price of natural gas has shot up tremendously in the last couple of years?
Yes.
And that's the main competitive, when you describe more efficient plants and how difficult it is for Zimmer to compete, it's really natural gas fueled plants that are this more efficient competition, am I correct?
Again, I think this is a drastic oversimplification. There are very complicated market dynamics in place here, and I'm just not comfortable testifying as to, the specifics of, gas and power prices. There are dynamics that we're not discussing that I'm not an expert in, and I'm not comfortable testifying to.
That's all I have for now.
Ms. Bauerschmidt?
Emily, after your cross-examination, is there anything else that you would like to highlight to the board?
No.
And at this point in time, we would like to go through Mr. Riley's appraisal report. Can we start with that?
Yes, sure.
Thank you very much. Mr. Riley, if you could just state your name for the record, please.
Oh, sure, it's Kevin Riley.
And what is your vocation, Mr. Riley?
My location?
Your vocation.
I'm a professional appraiser.
And if you could, do you have any financial interest in the subject property, in the ownership of this property, or the outcome of this case?
No.
Were you retained to appraise the property, which I think we've been identifying as the Zimmer power plant?
Yes, I was.
And pursuant to that assignment, did you prepare an appraisal report?
Yes, I did.
And are your appraisal qualifications set forth in your appraisal report, Mr. Riley? And if so, if you could tell the board where they would find your appraisal qualifications?
Yes, they are in my report in Appendix G, which is page 100, starts at 100, page 140.
If you could tell the board, so and let's just go through the last 5 years. What has been your experience in appraising power plants in the last 5 years?
I would estimate the number of plants that I have appraised to be about 150 power plants in the last 5 years.
And do you appraise other energy-related properties as well as power plants?
Yes, our firm is focused on energy valuation. We do primarily power plants, but we also get involved in things like oil refineries, large chemical plants, pipelines. Actually appraised the Alaskan pipeline a few years back.
And if you could, have you appraised other properties in Ohio prior to appraising the subject Zimmer power plant?
Yes, I have.
And have you testified as an expert before local boards of revision and the Board of Tax Appeals within the state of Ohio?
Yes, I have testified in front of both boards.
And have you been an expert and testified as an expert in other courts outside the state of Ohio?
Yes, our work, we do appraisal work all over the country. I've testified in front of numerous different jurisdictions across the country.
And if you could tell the board, have you solely appraised properties on behalf of property owners, or have you also appraised power plants and other energy-related properties for any governmental agencies?
We do work for both property owners and for governmental agencies. We recently, probably within the last 5 years, we've done several engagements working for government entities. In fact, one of the more recent ones that we've been engaged and worked on was in Michigan, where we were engaged by the state of Michigan, the Attorney General's office, to basically be a review appraiser, where we basically reviewed both the taxpayers and the county's appraisal reports provided by their experts.
And if you could tell the board, are you state certified in Ohio to appraise properties, and do you hold any appraisal designations?
Yes, I am a certified general real estate appraiser in the state of Ohio. I do hold a designation. It's the ASA. It's a senior accredited member of the American Society of Appraisers.
And approximately how long have you been appraising energy-related properties?
Since the end of 2001, early 2002.
At this point in time, I would ask the school board if they would stipulate to Mr. Riley's qualifications as they're set forth, starting on page 140 of his appraisal report and going through 143.
I would stipulate as to his credentials.
Thank you very much. Mr. Riley, if you could, did you inspect the subject property?
Yes, I inspected it in August of 2021.
And did you make both an interior and exterior inspection of the subject property?
Yes.
And if you could kind of walk us through your inspection of the property. Did you, first of all, did you review the county's industrial report as part of that process of walking through the facility?
Yes, we did. I was on site in August. I sat down with the plant manager. Prior to arriving on site, we had been provided with a good amount of information, plot plans, the industrial report. We were able to look at satellite imagery. When I was on site, I sat down with the plant manager. We went through the satellite imagery in his office. We were able to identify buildings. We went through the industrial report, again identifying the building and locations specific to each one, and then basically took a walking tour with him, continuing to look at all the structures.
And while you were inspecting the property, did you have photographs taken of the property, and did you include some of those photographs in your appraisal report?
Yes, I did.
And do those, first of all, where would we find those photographs?
That would be in Appendix A, which starts on page 52 of our report and runs through 55 of our report.
And do those photographs fairly typified what you observed upon your inspection?
Yes.
So if you could tell the board, how do you go about appraising a power plant?
Well, under the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, which is also referred to as USPAP, appraisers are required to consider three approaches to value. And in any appraisal assignment that we're engaged in, whether it's a power plant or any other energy-related property, we always consider the three approaches to value. The appraiser has to make judgment on what indicator best represents, value as far as what their scope and what they're actually appraising. In this case, we were engaged to value the real property associated with the Zimmer plant. So while we considered three approaches to value, we ultimately concluded that the cost approach was the best indicator value and only indicator value that we could get to just true value for the real property itself.
So let's just kind of go through these approaches. What would be the difficulty in doing a sales comparison approach in appraising a coal plant?
Well, again, when you're valuing just the real property, coal plants, I don't want to say they transact because really there is no market for these plants. No one wants to buy these things. But the further complexity is that when you're valuing just the real property at a coal plant, if there was a transaction of a full facility, you're buying the entire business. You're buying the operating machinery and equipment, you're buying personal property, you're buying working capital, you're going to buy components of intangible property, and then of course, the components of the real property, the buildings and land improvements would go with that as well. So there isn't a way to accurately discern or allocate value to just the real property in a sale if it were to occur.
And then if you could tell the board what the difficulty would be in doing an income approach for valuing the subject property as of January 1st, 2020.
Sure. It's similar to the sales comparison approach in that the income approach, if you were looking at a potential transaction of a coal facility, gets you to basically business value. In the income approach, all value of that business is inherent. That would be, the land, real property, personal property, and again, of course, intangible assets and working capital. That's the definition of business enterprise value. And as we're only tasked and our scope was to value just the real property, being able to discern or allocate and come to a conclusion of value, I don't feel comfortable with necessarily making those allocations to get to just the value of the real property.
So if you could tell the board, when you walked through the property, what did you physically ascertain as to the plant itself? Kind of give us an overview of the property and its overall condition, so that the board, it's one thing to say, yes, it's a power plant, but if you could kind of give us a flavor for what this property really is.
Sure. And so, as I testified, I've probably appraised 400 or 500 power plants, over my career. 150 within the last 5 years, all different technologies, from nuclear plants to coal plants to gas plants. The thing that when we got engaged and we're scoping out the engagement, we were engaged to evaluate a coal plant. I had an understanding of what to expect. We received the industrial report, and I went, holy cow, there's a lot more buildings here than I expected. And, that's true. This thing, the thought process of this plant, started back in the 60s. construction of it was a nuclear plant. You know, there was some objection across cross-examination on regarding the nuclear facility, and that it wasn't you know, just necessarily designed that way. I think it was kind of how I heard that. My understanding of discussions with plant personnel is that this thing was 98%, 99% ready to go. They had nuclear fuel on site, ready to burn. And it was designed as a nuclear plant. There's over 80 buildings at this facility. If you were building a coal plant today, and I have appraised the newest coal plant in the US, it was Sandy Creek down in Texas. It has probably 25% of the number of buildings that are there. There's a reactor building in which I walked through, which was dark. We had flashlights. It was empty. It's got 4-foot thick concrete walls. I mean, you know, the inspection was, you know, the other thing that I took away, and I actually came back to the office and told the guys in the office, it was pretty interesting to see, was the water gate structure. You know, the basement's about 50 feet deep. It's got concrete columns on top of the building that were designed to put in place so if a missile were to hit it, it would not be taken out. Fukushima in Japan had a nuclear meltdown because it lost its cooling water. Cooling water in a nuclear facility is probably one of the most important aspects. These are things you don't see in a coal plant. So when I walked around, it was overwhelming just to see the excess amount of structures that were not needed. And if you were to build it as a coal plant today and replace it, you know, a fraction of the infrastructure that's on site would be replaced.
So tell us then how you went about, and obviously, maybe we should go. So what was the property price that you paid?
When the recording stops.
Go ahead and start recording if you want.
Okay, we are recording. Can you all hear us now?
Yes.
Okay, the recording did stop again, but we got stopped quicker this time.
I know the dude now, so.
So give us just 1 second. You think we're all right now?
Well, it'll probably fail at some point again, but we'll just power on, back on again.
Okay.
out here, right?
We've got the IT guy here, so he's right on it, but sorry about that. So I guess we can continue on. Just probably need you to repeat the last question, Ms. Bauerschmidt. Sorry about that.
Thank you very much. Is there anything else that you need to discuss regarding this appraisal assignment before we get into property description?
No.
So, did you provide in your appraisal report a property description?
Yes, I did.
I'm not gonna go through all of that because I know that you'll walk through it, but, is part of this, is there both business fixtures and machinery and equipment, being housed there as well as real estate?
Yes, there is.
And did you review the definition of business fixture for the state of Ohio?
Yes, I did. We discussed that on page 10 of my report.
So if you could, just kind of briefly tell the board, what assets you included, and if you excluded any assets, where we would find that in your appraisal report, if you could explain your thought process.
Sure. So the starting point, we talked about the industrial report that was developed by appraisal research. It was part of the 2020 revaluation. We utilized that as the starting point for the listing of the real property. You know, when I was on site, you know, clearly walking through the facility, and we knew what buildings were what and what they had identified as real property. there were certain aspects of the facility that if someone were to buy for it, they wouldn't be willing to necessarily pay for it. That would be the reactor. I mean, the reactor, like I said earlier in testimony, was dark. I mean, it's basically a pile of concrete sitting on site. It wasn't being used for anything, and so we excluded that. There was the business personal property items that were identified as real property in the industrial report. That would be what's known as the back-end pollution control equipment. Those were 2 precipitators and the FGDs that basically were put in place and I guess someone that, is not necessarily all that familiar with a power plant could walk by and confuse them for a building because, they have a metal shell around the outside, but it basically is a piece of equipment that is personal property. It's pollution control equipment. It is not a building. No one goes in them, maybe to clean them, and that's it. So we excluded those as well. The other thing that was identified in the industrial report as buildings were what they call coal mills, which based on the review of the report was clearly the coal, what called a coal transfer house. So the coal at Zimmer gets delivered by barge. And it is unloaded, and there's a series of conveyors that change in elevation. They'll go up to what is known as a coal transfer house. Then it'll drop to a different elevation, and it basically staggers and walks. The coal basically walks through the facility until it gets into the pulverizer and ultimately the boiler where it's burned to produce the heat and the energy for producing the steam. Those are not buildings. Those are personal property, in my opinion. Those are machinery, equipment, and a function of operating a coal plant. So, and we list all of those buildings that we excluded on page 11 of our report. And the other component where there were 3 buildings that were identified to us by plant management that were owned by Duke Energy as part of the transmission equipment or transmission facilities that they had on site.
And after you put together this summary, and I assume you also put the summary of the buildings on page 8 and 9?
That's correct.
And is that taken from the industrial report?
Yes, it was.
I know that you have, after that, you have put a lot of detail regarding the industry that this property is operating in. And I know it goes for several pages, but if you could just highlight to the board, and not go through all of those pages, but what are the important factors of the industry and market overview that the board needs to keep in mind when trying to determine a value for this property?
Well, I think the purpose of the industry and market overview section of our report is really we write reports to educate the reader so that they can get familiar with the industry in which the subject property operates. I think the biggest overview that or takeaway from this section is that this is a coal facility. Everyone, for the last decade, we've been talking about the war on coal. The war on coal is real. It continues to exist today. As Mr. Bryan testified to, there's numerous coal plants that are being shut down across the country, and they have been for the last decade. Whether it was environmental mandates or the economics, that exists. And, I think the takeaway is that, while there's numerous structures out there, the structures there are for the purpose to support a coal plant. And, the economics and the viability of the operating plants as a whole, as a coal plant, translates to the structures. There isn't another purpose for these structures, unless it's operating as a coal facility.
So then if you could tell the board, how did you come up and how did you determine the value for this property and a cost approach? Kind of walk us through, first of all, your basic methodology, and then we'll get into your cost approach itself.
Sure. So as mentioned, we considered all three approaches. We came to the conclusion that the sales and the income approach were not meaningful indicators of value just for real property. Typically, when we value coal facilities or power plants in general, and we're looking at just the real property, we're going to look at just the cost approach. In our cost approach, there's different methods that you can do. We use what's known as the comparative unit method. And we start that discussion on page 34 of our report. One of the best tools for an appraiser is Marshall & Swift, also known as Marshall Valuation Services. And what it allows us to do is go out and identify, the type of the building based on its square footage. What is the total cost on a square foot basis of each of the buildings, and basically build it up, cost for each structure. And so that was the general method that we utilized. And then once we developed that, the one thing that we realized that Marshall & Swift does not include is interest during construction, the financing costs, as well as property taxes during construction. So we added those to the base cost for Marshall & Swift, and then came up with the total replacement cost new. And then once we arrived at that, obviously that's kind of the starting point for valuing under the cost approach. We had to look at various forms of depreciation, and that would be the main three forms of depreciation are physical depreciation or physical deterioration, functional obsolescence, and then economic obsolescence. So we considered all of those approaches and came up with a concluded value.
Riley, there is in the cost approach reproduction cost and versus replacement cost. Which one did you utilize in your analysis?
We calculated about the replacement costs.
And if you could tell the board why you didn't do reproduction cost.
Well,
Okay, we're back online, go ahead.
Kevin, if you could kind of go back just a moment in your testimony and kind of talk to us. We were talking about the difference between reproduction and replacement costs.
sure. So reproduction cost is basically developing a cost new that represents an exact replica, meaning mirror image of exactly what exists with the same materials, the same building processes of when it was originally constructed. Replacement cost new is basically replacing a facility with equal utility and using modern technologies, using modern materials, and things of that nature. If you develop a replacement cost and a reproduction cost new, typically the reproduction cost new is higher than the replacement cost new, and the difference between the two is what's known as functional obsolescence due to excess capital cost. So most appraisers and pretty much 90% of the jurisdictions that I've worked in, if not more, just the starting point is the replacement cost. No one's going to go out and build an exact mirror image of a facility. There are certain jurisdictions that by, case law or statute require you to actually start with a reproduction costume. But ultimately you're ending up in the same place because you're going to take out that functional obsolescence.
Kevin, because this was originally constructed as a nuclear power plant, would that also cause you not to want to do the reproduction costs? Because I assume most of that would not have been, is not utilized based on your discussion so far, and would not be actually necessary for the operation of a coal plant.
That's correct. And, I talked about the reactor building with the concrete walls that were 4 feet thick. They were substantial. And the same instance as the intake structure, the cooling intake structure. If you're building a coal plant, and, there numerous of them, the cooling those buildings don't exist and they don't, aren't built that way. Even the turbine building that was right next to the reactor building, it was substantially over constructed, the walls as far as thickness go because of, its original design as a nuclear facility.
And if you could walk the board through your cost approach, and if you're at any special page of your appraisal report, if you could also tell the board what page you're on.
Sure. Our cost approach starts on the description narrative starts on page 34. On page 36 is where we identify and show ultimately the replacement cost new analysis summary. And as I mentioned earlier, our starting point was utilizing the industrial report and its description of the buildings, its identification of the buildings, its square footages, which I don't disagree with, based on my observation, on site discussions with plant management. So on page 36, we show ultimately what we came up with the replacement cost new. And then I testified to earlier that was the base replacement cost new that we developed but did not include the financing or interest during construction, as well as the property taxes during construction. So you can see on page 36 in row 8, we add roughly $21 million of indirects during construction to come up with a total replacement cost new of $198 million.
Now, the details of your replacement cost, that $176 million, where would we find that? Do you have the backup for that, and you also have the Marshall and Swift, or the Marshall Valuation Service backup in your appraisal report?
Yeah, yes, I do. So all the details in the analysis, and it's because of the number of buildings and the complexity of the buildings and volume, it's we put most of the support for this in the appendix. The details of the cost approach is in Appendix B, which starts at page 56 of our report and runs through page 62. And then we have the Marshall and Swift Valuation Service documentation and support that we relied on in Appendix C, which starts on page 64 of our report and runs through page 90.
And then walk us through then you it's just nice for the board to know that all that backup material is in your report. So what was your determination of replacement cost new? And then after you did that, tell the board what your next steps were in the cost approach.
Sure, so as I testified to earlier, we showed that the results of the replacement cost new, or we showed that on page 36. That was $198 million. And once we determined that, then the next step, and again, I testified this earlier, was to look at all the forms of depreciation. And so we're looking at things like physical depreciation and the functional obsolescence due to any excess operating costs, and then external or economic obsolescence. So the next step in what we consider, we talk about on page 38 of the report, and that's the physical deterioration. On page 40 is where we show, again, this is, if you look at page 40 of the report, you'll notice it looks familiar. It's the list of all the buildings, again, from the industrial report. And we were able to determine, the year that they were built, which was information from the industrial report, or information that was provided to us by plant management. And then we're able to look at the age and the average service life and come up with a percentage of physical depreciation, which we concluded the overall physical depreciation of the facility was 54%. And once we determined that, then we looked at the functional obsolescence issues, and we discussed that on page 42 of our report. Again, we're looking at the, any excess operating expenses. You probably could make an argument, based on the fact that this was built as a nuclear facility, and the age of the buildings, that they're not, it's not exactly how you would design a coal plant, that there could be some functional obsolescence due to excess operating expenses. We did not quantify that. We basically just said it was minimal. And then the last step in the depreciation calculations or consideration was the economic obsolescence. And, this is, anyone that operates and works or raises power generation facilities know that coal plants have had significant challenges over the last, decade. Basically going back to 2008 when fracking and natural gas production became readily available. So we looked at economic obsolescence in a couple of different ways. We looked at, what's known as the market monitor, it's the component, monitoring analytics. And what their role is they actually analyze the market, and they put out publications periodically. They have an annual report where it basically looks at the good, the bad, and the ugly of the market, and they report on that. There's different data that they publish in that document. And so one of the things that we look at is, and we talk about that on page 42, what is the ability to recover costs and net revenue differences. Basically, it's if you were going to build a new plant, what would you be able to recover your costs, and how much of the cost would you recover based on current market conditions? And so on page 43 of the report, we show a table that basically shows the AEP market. And it looks back from 2014 through 2019, and you can see that out of the cost of, if you were going to build a new coal plant based on levelized cost, what would you be able to recover? And it's in the teens, meaning that there's a substantial amount of shortfall or lack of revenue being able to be generated from operating a coal plant, which equates to economic obsolescence. So based on the analysis, in their analysis, it shows about 88% economic obsolescence. Looking at this isn't just as it relates to AEP or PJM or MISO. This is commonplace all across the country. There hasn't been a coal plant built since 2013, and that was the last coal plant seen in here testimony. That plant started construction in 2007, before the market changed. And once the market changed, they had steel in the ground. They were at the point where they couldn't turn back. And we're hopeful that the market would rebound, but it never did. There's a reason why it hasn't been a plant built since 2013. They're not economic. This clearly shows this is an independent source. This isn't EBC valuation or Enterprise's opinion coming up with this. These are an independent source that's reporting it based on the market or for market participants. Companies like this, Dynegy, whoever the reader of the report is, they rely on this information. The second analysis that we performed was known as a gross margin analysis. It basically looks at the cost of electricity or the price of electricity and what we can get for it, and then what the cost of fuel is. And fuel is one of the larger expenses, and as fuel costs change, price of electricity changes. You can measure that dynamic over time, and you can see when plants were profitable and plants were less profitable. And so we talk about that starting on page 43. And so what we're doing is over time we're looking at different benchmarks of, if you were going to build a plant, what would you need and what would you expect? What's a good market? What's a healthy market? And as I said, the market really, the dynamics changed in 2008. Prior to 2008, margins on coal plants were relatively healthy. When we started doing horizontal drilling and fracking on natural gas, even with hundreds of years of reserves, which drove the price of natural gas down, which drove the price of electricity down. Meanwhile, the price of coal remained relatively consistent, so the margins went from very profitable for coal plants to almost non-existent, or very low. And we show that dynamic on page 44. There's a chart or graph that you can look at that shows the 2007-2008 time period, and basically the second and third quarter of 2008 is when natural gas prices just collapsed. And it's remained low during that entire time period, and the expectation is that energy prices are going to remain low going forward. So based on the gross margin analysis, we ultimately concluded that EO was showing 60%, and we show the results on page 46 of the report. It ultimately concluded that the economic obsolescence for the Zimmer was 75%. And I'll apply that to our cost approach.
Having made those determinations, where would we find that calculation?
I think he's already testified to that.
I'm just asking where it is in the appraisal. Just the records clear of where that.
I think he said it was on page 46.
46.
We're not gonna be done by 11:30.
Then after that how have you been applying to this kind of value conclusion process, including the land value?
Okay, we're back on, go ahead.
Kevin, if you could just back up about 2 seconds and just give word the summary of your cost approach. I think you were talking about your depreciated, costs that you arrived at, and then you were just talking about land value.
Yes, so on page 48 and 49 of our report is basically the summary of the cost approach. And so once we developed the replacement cost new, we were able to apply the percentage of physical depreciation. We applied the 75% economic obsolescence. And if you go to page 49, you'll see the total in row 98 of roughly $22 million. And then we added back in the land value of $7,837,100, which was based on the Clermont County's auditors appraised value. And based on that, when we added the land value, our total concluded value under the cost approach was $30,500,000.
And Mr. Riley, what was your final guided conclusion for the real estate only of the subject parcels as of January 1st, 2020?
It was $30,500,000.
And I think you identified most of the things that included in your appendix, but if you could, just for purposes of the record, go through the appendix and just identify what you've included in your appendix of your appraisal report.
Sure. Appendix A are the photographs. Appendix B are all the details and little additional support for the cost approach analysis. Appendix C is the Marshall and Swift support that we utilize in our analysis. Appendix D is a copy of the industrial report that was performed by Appraisal Research. Appendix E are assumptions and limiting conditions. Appendix F is my science certification. And Appendix G is my qualifications.
Thank you very much. That concludes our presentation as it relates to Mr. Riley's appraisal report. Our only housekeeping item that we would like to amend the complaints that we filed in this case to reflect the value as Mr. Riley just opined to, with a total value of $30,500,000.
Thank you. Mr. Demusio?
Yeah, just a couple things. I know there was extensive and lengthy testimony about the fact that there's some buildings there that are not needed for coal. Are you aware that the county's already made substantial reductions? In fact, I was surprised there was any value on the reactor building. I know, I think they used to put some value on because they used to use it for storage. But if you can turn to your Appendix D, page 8 of your Appendix D, isn't it true that even though the replacement cost of the reactor building on the county industrial report was over $28 million, they were only showing a value of about $1.9 million, is that correct?
Page 98 of my report, I'm sorry.
No, page 8 of Appendix D.
Yeah, it's 98 in total.
I don't see a page. Oh, I got it. Page, yeah. Reactor building 5, yeah, 1.9 million.
1.9.
Which
So,
my point is it shouldn't be included at all.
sure, I understand, and that's fine. But it's not your contention, is it, that the county industrial report includes full market value for these buildings that were really dedicated to the nuclear facility only?
No, that is my contention.
That they applied full value to these nuclear as if it was usable?
Yeah, that's my contention, and they include clearly the pollution control equipment, which is all the FLV and the precipitators, which isn't even a building, it's a piece of machinery and equipment.
But again, well, I'm a little confused. Maybe you don't understand my question. It's not your contention, is it, that the county failed to make some adjustment for the fact that certain buildings were dedicated solely to the nuclear facility?
I don't know what I mean, they made adjustments, they have a percent good that's shown. I don't know what their analysis was or what their methodology was.
But the percent good
what the
doesn't.
value is representing or what they're trying to represent.
Okay, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this. It seems obvious to me from what we just discussed. If the replacement cost new is $28 million and they're carrying it for $1.9 million, then obviously they've not applied full value. Am I correct, to the nuclear reactor building?
Well, there's depreciation. I don't know how to answer your questions. You're talking about a replacement cost new and a value. I mean, I have a replacement cost new and a value that's different, so I'm not applying whole, I think you're trying to look at replacement cost new as value, and then the total value is value and comparing the two. I don't know. I mean, they made adjustments. I'm not gonna
Did you
deny that.
I was confused by your testimony. You said you met with some representatives of the owner. You went over the various buildings. Do you recall that testimony early in your testimony?
Yes.
And you went over some of the, I think they were what, satellite pictures?
We walked through, yes, satellite imagery.
Right. Now you mentioned that, I'm sorry, you mentioned that there were some facilities that were owned by Duke that were transmission facilities. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Did you go back and see if those were on the industrial report?
Yes.
Okay, and where would I find those on Exhibit D?
No, I identified them in my report on page. Page 11. It's building 15, 30, and 31. So you're gonna find them on your page 8. Building 15, 30, and 31. So the page we were just on, page 98 of my report.
And they're 1,000 square, each one on 15s, 1,000. In fact, it must be the same building. Building 15 is about 1,000 square feet, am I correct?
1,024.
And what was the other Duke building?
30 and 31.
30 and 31, okay. And those are less than 3,000 square feet.
Okay, we're back on. You want to repeat your question?
Yeah. Do you know if, for buildings 30 and 31, do you know if they were, it says they were office buildings, is that correct?
One I would classify as somewhat like an office, and the other one was a utility building.
And then the rest of the buildings that weren't Duke, that weren't related to transmission, I assume that includes buildings 160.
Okay, we're back on.
I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but you did exclude certain assets that you think were part of what the county is. Are we back on? Of what you think?
Okay, can you hear us now?
I can hear you.
Okay, we'll try again.
All right. Other than the reactor on page 11.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Denizio.
All right. Just to wrap up page 11. Other than the reactor-related buildings, other than the 2 or 3 small Duke buildings, are there any other buildings on page 11 that do not fit those 2 categories?
Yeah, but you can't get it up.
There we go.
It's recording now.
Okay, can everyone hear us now?
Our camera's jumpy, can you see?
Yes.
Okay,
You can hear.
sorry, we're having some technical difficulties we're trying to address.
Camera is off.
Okay, well, goodness.
Okay, it looks like it's working for the moment.
Okay, all right, we'll try again.
Alrighty, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Line.
Don't know if that should-
Laptop maybe?
I think they.
Okay, it's recording.
Yeah, they took yours. Finally, it was working.
See, now you got the one that's broken. You don't need to see these. Okay, we are going to proceed. Mr. Demisio?
Yes, on page 11, do you see there, of your report, do you see where you have buildings 30 and 31 listed as office?
Yes.
All of the buildings below that, from 132 down to 207, are any of those related to the reactor or to the transmission property of Duke?
No, 132 through 166 are the coal transfer houses, which are just enclosures that have conveyors through them. And 200 through 207 is all the back end pollution control equipment. So, sorry, 200 through 206.
Okay, so the 200 through 206,
Actually, 207, I apologize.
okay. And those are buildings that, they're real estate structures, but you think since they house pollution control equipment, they're somehow exempt?
No, they're not real estate structures at all.
Aren't they?
Not at all. They're pieces of equipment. They take out particulates, they take out SO2. They are back-end pollution control equipment. They are not structures. They have some steel siding that makes it look like a building. They are not real estate at all.
Okay. Do they appear, but they do appear on the industrial report?
Yes, they're on page 99 of my report, which is page 9 of the industrial report. All the back-end equipment is listed on that page.
Okay. Did you ask the owner if they've been reporting those buildings we've just discussed, if they've been reporting those as personal property to the state?
I did ask that question, and I believe that they are on their renditions that they filed, so they're getting double taxed.
Did they show you a copy of their personal property tax return?
I have personally not seen it.
Now on page 30, if you could turn to page 37, you indicate that you did utilize Marshall Swift, am I correct?
Yes.
And I saw in the appendix, you listed a number of pages or calculation methods from the Marshall Swift publication, am I correct? I think it was appendix C.
Oh, there are calculations. We utilized information from Marshall Swift.
But did you had check marks next to some. Are those the ones where those classifications of buildings, are those the cost factors you used?
Yes.
Okay. Did you look at the, when you did your inspection, did you look at any scrubbers that exist at the Zimmer plant to scrub out sulfur?
Yes.
So it's your opinion as an expert, isn't it, that if a coal generation facility has a scrubber, it can buy less expensive coal, am I correct?
I wouldn't agree with that.
I'm sorry?
I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. There's a lot of market dynamics that go into that.
Isn't it true that high sulfur coal, everything else being equal, high sulfur coal is less expensive than coal which has less sulfur?
Historically it has, but the issue is the transportation cost. It has nothing to do with the sulfur content.
Sure. But again, everything else being equal, if you were transferring a barge full of low sulfur coal and transferring a barge of high sulfur coal, assuming the weight was the same, the high sulfur coal barge load would cost less, substantially less, than the high quality low sulfur coal.
I would disagree. I don't think it's substantially less.
I was confused. You testified that you did the replacement cost rather than the reproduction cost. But yet it looks like you did try to value each building that was there, am I correct, except the ones on page 11?
That's correct. We utilized the information from the industrial report. We developed a replacement cost for each building that was there.
Did you have access to the FERC data necessary if you had wanted to do a FERC analysis where you look at the cost expended by the prior owner and then trend it upwards? Did you try to do that?
What FERC information are you referring to?
The regulated coal companies, weren't they in the old days required to report to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission the cost data for each of the 311 items on the FERC report, am I correct?
Not that I'm aware. Not to any level of detail that would have been useful.
That wasn't my question. My question was, historically, wasn't that kind of information reported to FERC?
Not that I'm aware of.
You've done FERC-based, cost-based analysis in the Lake County case, haven't you, that I'm also involved in? Where you took the FERC data on the East Lake plant and trended it?
Well, I mean, if we're gonna go there, just for clarification, are you talking about the actual information that is on the FERC website? Or are you talking about the information that was provided to me by the client that has FERC account numbers on it, which was the continuing property record?
Right, that's my question. So,
I just need to be clear because you're referencing FERC information, and that was not FERC information, that was company information that had FERC accounts on them.
all right. Prior to 9/11 of 2000, September of 11, isn't it true that that kind of FERC data was actually reported into FERC and was publicly available?
No, it was not reported into FERC and was not publicly available. The information that you're referencing was company-specific information that was provided in that case. Site
preparation costs, I tried to find those on your cost analysis. All I found was a $14 million. Am I correct that you allocated for site preparation costs? Actually, I take that back. You referred to it as site improvements?
Correct. It's on page 63 of our report.
Did you make any effort to figure out the site preparation costs of what's actually there? The cost to raise this up out of the floodplain, the cost of all the special concrete and drainage systems and all that sort of thing that actually were put in there to prepare for the generation requirements of the subject property?
I would say yes, that would be included in the M&S numbers.
Well, I looked, one of the one of the pages where you describe it, you had a footnote, and it looked like it related mostly to, it's on page 41. You say site improvements include paving, pedestrian walks, curbing, fencing, and rail spurs. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So you're not including any of the cost of raising this thing up out of the floodplain, any of the complicated drainage systems and such that were put into the site so it could operate?
I would disagree with that. The M&S numbers are final, complete construction costs, which basically look at ranges of unique situations and their average cost. So I would basically, I think you're confusing what my site improvements are. My site improvements are the actual physical real property, like bridges, pedestrian bridges, the pavement, things of that nature. It has nothing to do with the site preparation. All of those dollars are included in the M&S numbers.
Ms. Bauernschmidt asked you about your experience in testifying before the BTA. Do you recall that question?
Yes.
How many times have you testified in front of the BTA?
One time.
And could you tell the board whether you won or lost that case?
Well, I think the better question is to ask.
No, you're right. I did not word that. I did not word that properly. Was your appraisal valuation adopted by the BTA?
I'm going to say yes.
You say yes?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. That's all I had.
Ms. Bauerschmidt?
Thank you very much. Kevin, is there anything additional that you would like to tell the board regarding your appraisal, or an explanation regarding that decision from the Board of Tax Appeals and some Lake County case that the school board had just referenced?
I don't think it was a Lake County case, but I'll let.
I thought you just said Lake County.
I don't think I did.
Okay.
I said Ohio, and he said he testified once.
Okay, so in the Board of Tax Appeals matter that the school board just referenced, if you wanted to do any further explanation regarding the decision?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't, they didn't take, there were two experts, two appraisal experts. They didn't pick one winner, one loser. They adopted positions from, I would say, both sides. And I think it was more favorable towards our position, or in my opinion, than the other sides. They accepted the concept of economic obsolescence. I think that it's obviously clear in this case, and in any coal plant across the country, especially in operating in PJM, that there's a significant level of economic obsolescence that hurts the values of property associated with the coal plant. I mean, you pick up any newspaper over the last decade that talks about the war on coal. You look at public documents that are provided by third-party providers, like the market monitors, who are saying that there's 88% shortfall on the justification and the operations of coal facilities. That has to be addressed at some point in valuation. Otherwise, it's a fatal flaw in any number that's produced in any report that doesn't include that.
And there was some discussion regarding whether or not you included site preparation costs in your cost approach. If you could expand to the board and explain how the site preparation costs are included in your cost approach.
Sure. So the M&S numbers include, obviously, the physical assets that are being put in place, the construction, the operating profits, site preparation, basically everything. They're considered final costs. They include everything except for interest during construction or the financing. and then property taxes, which is what we added, calculated and added to our Marshall Swift numbers.
Thank you very much. Emily, if I could just ask you a question. The appraiser was asked a question on cross-examination relating to whether or not certain items were included on the company's rendition on personal property. To the best of your knowledge, were those included in the rendition to the state?
Yes, to the best of my knowledge, those are included in the rendition.
Thank you. Anything else, either Kevin, you would like to say to the board, or Emily, that you would like to raise to the board?
One point I would like to make is, the shutdown decision, we discussed, it was announced publicly on September of 2020. I just want to make clear again, the conditions that prompted that were in place as of the valuation date and for several years prior to that. So I don't want to imply that that was not a condition that existed on the valuation date.
Thank you. And Kevin, is there anything else that you would like to tell the board regarding this person?
I actually, just to follow up on that point that Emily just made, I think it's clear from the market monitor information that's in our report, where we talk about the economic obsolescence and the shortfall. To Emily's point, that stuff, when we're looking back at, back to 2014, and it's clear that market phenomenon was impacting plants like Zimmer for years.
Thank you.
Yeah, they basically, as of the appraisal date, were trying to figure out what to do, trying to keep the doors open any way they could, and it was a struggle.
Thank you very much. Obviously, that concludes the property owner's presentation, and we appreciate the board's time and attention today. And obviously, I don't know if the school board has any evidence that they're going to be supplying.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Demizu, any redirect?
No, but
At this
I
time?
would have a
Okay.
small presentation.
Yeah, we'll give you both an opportunity for cross-examination.
No, what I meant, I'm not sure we understood.
I'm sorry, for
I do-
closing statement.
No.
Go ahead.
I do have a presentation. I
Okay.
thought you asked about any
Okay,
cross-examination.
yes, I did. So do you want to proceed with your
Yeah,
presentation?
I submitted, I think, an important document. I didn't submit the whole thing because I think it's 60-plus pages, but I did submit an excerpt from that case that the county actually was involved in, this county, and they actually had hired an expert back in the late 90s to look at the Zimmer plant. It went up, and that was actually litigated, one of the few large coal electric generating plants that was actually litigated at the BTA. Many have come up since and been settled before trial, but this one was one we took up, and it actually, the BTA gave us an indication of what the proper approach is. And what happened, if you turn to, I'll direct you to some of the key pages. Page 38, which is about halfway through what I sent in, you'll see at the bottom, the BTA says, we find unsupportable deductions made by appellant's experts for costs claimed to be attributable to personal rather than real property. And they explain on the next page that there's a very high burden for anybody arguing that. It's very difficult and expensive to prove it. But if you have structures that house equipment, which is what we really have here, those structures are in fact real property. If they want to reclassify something that is the county has classified as real property and say it's personal property, it presents all kinds of problems, and the taxpayer needs to come forward with its personal property tax records and show that in fact they are being double taxed. We hear this allegation a lot, but but a lot of times, we never see the personal property tax returns. And if in fact they're being taxed twice, they shouldn't be. I suspect they're not, but we would need to see where they're actually reporting it to the state before it can be reclassified. And that's a heavy burden, and simply having an expert say, I think they're being double taxed is not enough. They need to actually come forward and produce that evidence. In the case from years ago, on page 40, they took a little bit different approach. They argued that, roughly, I think it was roughly 70% of what was in the building, the steel, they felt was a business fixture. And again, that was rejected by the VTA, and they said that you can't really do that. And again, if they did do that, they would have to show that they're reporting it as personal property. If you don't do that, you end up having what I call a black hole, where you have assets that are excluded as, well, they're not real estate, but they never get taxed as personal property, and they fall in this black hole where they never get taxed, which obviously would not be fair. The most important reason I sent this in is on page 47. The county hired Mr. Willingham as its expert, and he used the Marshall Swift approach. And you'll see there on page 47, they reject that approach. They say that it really can't be on the fourth or fifth line. It says this data, we do not believe this data can be easily applied to the improvements to which most of the value is attributable. They go on to say that the subject's primary improvements are highly specialized and clearly distinct from the heavy industrial building category utilized by Willingham. There really is no Marshall Swift. There's no power plant designation. There's nothing in there about raising plants up out of the floodplain. This is very, very expensive. There's nothing about the very detailed and expensive site preparation costs that you need in order to operate a plant of this nature. So it's not proper to use the Marshall Swift approach. They go on to say on page 48 that they end up adopting the Board of Education's experts. What they did there was they ended up using this FERC approach I mentioned, where they received the FERC cost data for each individual component of the plant. And the 311, what are called the 311 FERC accounts, those are real property accounts. And they look at all those. You can see what it cost back in the 70s and 80s to build this. I think it opened in the early 90s and late 80s. And they can then take that information and trend it upwards with inflation. So you get some idea of what it really costs. Then at that point, you can go ahead and take your physical depreciation, which is appropriate, and then you can take your economic obsolescence, which is fine if you can prove that. On that last point, I wanted the board to see on page 43 of Mr. Riley's report, when one of the methodologies he uses to do his economic depreciation, or his economic depreciation, is he tries to find the differences between the coal prices and how easy it might be to recoup those costs. And he indicates that he used the coal prices, this is on the second last paragraph of page 43, he uses the historical prices based upon the price realized by independent power producers in the state of Ohio. So he's using basically an average Ohio rather than this low-cost coal. One of the reasons Zimmer has lasted this long and has not been shut down is because it's highly efficient. It's able to use low-cost coal, whereas many of its competitors didn't have the ability to scrub out the sulfur. So they had to buy more expensive, high-quality coal that was low in sulfur. So none of that would have been recognized in his response, or his analysis. He simply used average cost, which is fine if you're valuing an average plant, but the Zimmer plant is not average because it has this very expensive pollution control equipment which strips out the sulfur and allows the company to use low-cost coal, which its competitors can't use unless they have similar expensive technology. So I don't think they've met their burden. They've used methodologies that have been rejected by the Board of Tax Appeals. And so I don't think the report's probative, and I'd ask for no reduction.
Mr. Hoffman, Yes, ma'am. We would introduce Richard Hoffman. I'm holding a document. I assume all of you have a copy of this. Did you prepare this document, Mr. Hoffman?
Yes, ma'am. We do not have a copy of anything that Mr. Hopkins has been.
Okay, it is his qualifications. Can we get that emailed to him? Okay, we'll get that emailed over to you.
Thank you very much.
And Mr. Hoffman, is this an accurate representation of your professional qualifications?
Yes, ma'am.
And would you like to address the board at this time?
Yes, ma'am. We've heard a good deal of testimony and cross-examination, especially of Mr. Riley. Principally, his testimony resides upon the document which has been introduced to the board. I would call your attention to page 138 and the first bullet point, which suggests that this appraisal was prepared for the exclusive use of the plan of record and for the specific intended use and purpose of this report. Now, the stated purpose is to the company for evaluating the reasonableness of ad valorem property assessments. I do not believe, since the Board of Revision was not named as an intended user, that this document is legitimately before the board, and therefore I do not believe there's competent and probative evidence upon which to base the decision for the BOR.
Thank you. Next, we're going to move to Teresa Mahon. Teresa, did you prepare this document?
Yes, I did.
And is it an accurate reflection of your professional qualifications?
Yes, it is.
Ms. Bauerschmidt, you don't have that either?
I do not.
Okay, we'll get that emailed to you. Ms. Mahon, would you like to address the board?
Yes, in reviewing the appraisal report, I found several deficiencies that I feel were just violations. In regards to the land value, he did not conduct a market analysis and say, okay, I came up with my own land value. He simply relied on the counties. I don't feel like that's the beginning of a good appraisal. And then he goes on to value the buildings. Never in the appraisal do we see each individual building. I understand that we have all these buildings. It's very cumbersome, but nonetheless, the appraisal should have said this building, this square footage, and what costs were used out of Marshall Swift. Instead of just listing something in an addendum, we don't know which buildings applied to which one of these costs. We never see an analysis that says these buildings were put on at this cost with this depreciation and this economic obsolescence. So I really feel like this appraisal, if it is indeed an appraisal, because I concur with what Mr. Hoffman said, it's not addressed to the board. I don't feel like the analysis was complete enough to say, you know, we're saying these costs are correct and these costs are, when really we don't even see a cost they came up with, how they came to the value of each building. The other thing I found is he did say the highest and best use of this property is as a power plant. As of 1/1/20, that's the lien date. He's saying this is a functioning power plant and that's its continued use. I feel like a more accurate description in the highest and best use would have been an interim use. To say this is an interim use and as a power plant, knowing that we're going to be closing, or as she had testified, they had known all along that, you know, this was going that direction. So instead he says, no, it's a functioning power plant. Well, then you have to value it as a functioning power plant. So I feel like if he were gonna say, well, now these things aren't important and these things are, I just don't feel like this appraisal gives us enough information. It's very general. Everything's very generalized. Never do I see where any of the calculations are performed for the individual structures. As a county, we're charged with looking at these buildings and saying, this is the square footage, this is how we're gonna value these. And I just don't feel like they came up with enough burden of proof to say, yours is wrong, because this is what we find is right. I don't see those calculations within the report. As far as the physical depreciation, I do want to just touch on that. He does mention in this report that on page 42, he says, new materials and technology replaced in the same capacity plant. No, that's not where I want to go. It says similar one. Let me find it real quickly. The point I'm making is he says that the plant was kept up, that there were standards to be met throughout to meet regulatory needs. So when you're set to that standard, when this is an operating plant, and you have to keep the physical plant up, that increases the effective age of these buildings. They couldn't let these just sit here all this time and deteriorate. So the same physical depreciation, it slows for a place like this where it's so regulated. So I don't feel like any of that was taken into account, like the effective age. You know, what is the effective age of this building sitting here? We would do that throughout the county, regardless of what kind of use was on the property. But I feel like they just took, this was a year it came in, and this is the physical depreciation. So I guess this all goes back to, I feel like there was an analysis of each building and what it's being used and its effective age. I don't feel like the land value was established separately. I just don't feel like they came up with a value that was supported. So it's hard to look at our value and say, our value is wrong, their value is right, when I don't feel like they met their burden of proof by doing a full analysis. So for that reason, I would ask the board not to give weight to this document.
Ms. Bauerschmidt?
May we respond?
Yes.
First of all, may I ask a question of Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Hoffman, your company is the mass appraisal company that determined the value for the subject property?
Yes, ma'am.
And did you have any input in the value of this particular property for the January 1st, 2020?
No, ma'am, I did not personally have.
And have you appraised the property for purposes of the Board of Revision hearing today?
I have not.
And have you physically inspected the subject property?
Years ago, yes, ma'am, but not recently.
And when you say years ago, is it 5 years ago, 10 years ago?
I would say 3 or 4 years ago.
And you are making a conclusion as to a violation of use cap today against Mr. Riley?
Yes, ma'am. I'm suggesting that there is no intended user that indicates the Clermont County Board of Revision, which I could not find in the 144 pages that I read.
And are you aware that this was in fact submitted to the Board of Revision prior to the hearing?
Yes, ma'am.
Opening? Okay. I have no further questions of Mr. Hoffman. And Ms. Macon, you testified today. Did you have any input in the valuation of this property for the 2020 tax year?
No.
And have you physically inspected the subject property?
No.
And I don't have your appraisal qualifications, but do you hold any appraisal designations from the Appraisal Institute?
No. I was generally certified in the states of Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana, and no longer keep those current.
So you don't have any state certifications at this time?
No.
And are you opining to a value today?
No.
And then I'd like to follow up with Mr. Riley and Ms. O'Brien on a couple of very important items. First of all, Mr. Riley, there's been an allegation from Mr. Huffman that you have violated use cap, and further that because of your wording in your appraisal, that the board should not consider your appraisal today. Do you have some comments regarding their allegation that you have violated use cap?
Yes, I do. Over my career, I've authored probably over 300 appraisal reports. I worked at American Appraisal. We had a very strong legal group. We had attorneys that specialized in use cap with the understanding, because that's all American Appraisal did was appraisals. This was generally standard language I've used throughout my entire career. As far as intended users on page 3 of our report. We talk about the intended user, listing Vistra as the only intended user. That's following use path. You have one intended user, and we clearly state in the 3rd paragraph or the 2nd paragraph that Vistra may disclose copies of the appraisal report to the property interest holders, legal advisors, and the appropriate taxing authorities and courts. Courts would imply boards. That's standard language I've used throughout my entire career. It's never been questioned, it's never been challenged, it's never been legally unallowed.
And one other situation is, when you did this appraisal, you were aware that it was going to be disclosed by the corporation, your client, to the Board of Revision?
Yes.
And there was an allegation from Ms. Macon regarding your land value and the several deficiencies that, quote, she claimed that you had in your appraisal report. If you could comment on the land value and the other deficiencies and violations that she has alleged against you today.
Sure. So the land value, we looked at the assessed land value, and I've appraised land in Ohio before. That land value came in right around $25,000 an acre. Felt that that was a good and fair value. And so instead of, in an effort to, I guess, limit our scope and fees, we agreed that that was reasonable. It's common practice in the appraisal world, especially in power generation facilities, is to utilize an assessed value of land if you agree that it's within, the range of reasonableness. I agree with it. As far as the calculations.
Can you also address the interim use that there was an allegation that because it is, first of all, a retrospective appraisal, you're praising it as of January 1st, 2020. The fact that you had it as a functioning power plant as the highest and best use?
Yes, and it was functioning as a power plant as of January 1st, 2020. As I said, it was, as many coal plants at that time period were struggling, trying to figure out what their future was going to look like. Obviously, there's been a numerous number of coal plants across the country that have shut down prior to 2020. Pretty much all coal plants are evaluating themselves on an annual basis to figure out what their future is. But as of that appraisal date, and we did a retrospective, we concluded that, because it was operating, that its highest and best use was to continue operating, at least, in the near term.
And then you wanted to address some other comments that Ms. Macon made against you?
There are comments about calculations not showing square footages of buildings and the numbers that we use from M&S in the computations. If you go to page, it's Appendix B, it's page 62 and 63. That is our development of our replacement cost mill. We identified the construction class as put out in M&S. We look at the square footage, the number of stories, lineal feet, average height. We have an adjusted height, perimeter adjustment, height adjustment, current adjustment, location adjustment. Then we come up with an adjusted cost and we multiply that by the square footage. There's more information that goes behind this spreadsheet, but this is, the basis of the computations of how we develop a replacement cost mill. All the other supports and information that really is needed by the reader to understand exactly how we did, calculated numbers contained in our work file.
And why didn't you use the FERC cost data?
So there was, in my cross-examination, there were questions about FERC data and reported to FERC. What Mr. DeMuzios was talking about is not FERC information that's out there and available to the public. It is information that's contained at the company level that has its continuing property record, where when an asset's put in place, its original cost and the date that it was installed was recorded. And that's how they keep up with, and it was, regulated entities were required to do that for regulatory purposes. And so when we appraise power plants, that's one of the questions that we've always asked is, we would like a copy of your continuing property record. Sometimes we get them, sometimes we don't. If we get them, sometimes they're useful, sometimes they're not. What I mean by that is, oftentimes when you have a purchase of a plant or a company, as Vistra bought Dynegy, you have fresh start accounting done or purchase price allocation when they're establishing books. Vistra, when they bought Dynegy, they didn't carry over book values. They established their own. They don't care about what the book value of Dynegy was at the time. They basically were starting over their own asset ledger. So what happens in that case is when the purchase price allocation is done for financial reporting purposes, the values that are attributed to it, the fair value under accounting principles and accounting rules, the value that is started at that point is based on the purchase price. So if I had an asset that was put in 1990 originally, and I had the old company records, it would say X number of dollars, and it would give a description. That information, if I have it, could be useful. What happens in the purchase price allocation is they bought it in 2018, I think it was April, if I remember correctly. But they bought it in April of 2018. You'll look at the asset ledger, and we received it. I would say 80% of the assets, if not 90% of the assets, had the April 2nd, whatever the date was, 2018. Clearly, and we had conversations with them, it was clearly basically a reestablishment of the purchase price or a reallocation of the purchase price, not the original cost. So even if we had that information, it's completely useless and has no factor on value at all. It has to do with their allocated purchase price that they bought 40,000 megawatts of power and allocated some value to Zimmer. So for those reasons, we didn't use it.
Emily, if you could tell the board why you didn't submit the personal property tax return for purposes of this hearing today?
Sure. So that contains a lot of financial information of the company, which is competitive information. It's privileged in many cases, so we limit distribution. We do not share that when it becomes a matter of public record. We have in the past shared it under, NDAs, other places where we are confident we can keep it confidential, but it has substantial financial information attached to it. We are a publicly traded company. We have SEC regulated financial statements. We can't just release competitive financial information.
But is there any kind of redacted, if it could be kept from being publicly disclosed, is there a redacted form that you could provide just as to those elements that were raised today?
Yeah, I don't see why we couldn't do that.
And if the board would like that, the only reason that Emily did not supply it today was because she's aware that anything that we supply to the Board of Revision is a matter of public record, and there's no way that the Board of Revision can keep anything confidential. Everything is a public record. It's only on appeal to the Board of Tax Bills that we have a way to keep certain confidential information actually truly confidential and private among the parties.
Okay.
Anything else, Emily or Kevin?
Not for me.
Okay. Mr. Demuzio?
I just have a closing one.
Actually, there was one other point, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
There was testimony about the condition of and operations of the equipment at the facility and the age and that they're well maintained. And that's generally true for most power plants. I will note that we based our age first on a chronological age. And if you actually look at page 60 of our appraisal report, our physical deterioration analysis, you'll see a column called chronological age. And then we have a percentage of effective age to chronological age. And that's based on experience where we realize that assets are well maintained or have been replaced when needed. And that if a building was built 10 years ago, its chronological age is 10. But things might have been improved or maintained to a level where the effective age is something less. And we've done, again, without having the continuing property record that was meaningful, we couldn't mathematically calculate that. But I've done analysis in the past where we have had continuing property records that are meaningful and have been able to analyze and come up with a percentage of what the effective age is to the chronological age. So if you look at that 10-year asset, it's somewhere between 60 and 80% typically. And we concluded that, for these, that it was about 75%. So if I had a 10-year-old asset, I was basically saying that its effective age was 7.5 years. So we did take into consideration the maintenance and the upkeep of the equipment and of the real property. I think that was a false statement.
I have one more thing also, sorry. It was suggested that Zimmer is in some way more efficient and better than its peer coal plants. That is also a false statement. If it were better and more efficient, it would remain open. We have no incentive to close it if it's a great plant, if it's operating efficiently, if we can make it economic. That is in everyone's interest. So the suggestion that it is somehow better and less costly to run than other coal plants is just categorically false.
If I could, just because that was pointed at me. When I say better and more efficient, it's better and more efficient than its competition. Its competition's
That's also false.
Well,
yeah, that's also false. Gas plants are significantly more efficient than coal plants.
Right. I'm talking about other coal plants, and obviously
again, it's false because we made the decision to shut it down because it's not efficient and it's not economic to run.
I'll deal with that in my closing. Okay, sorry.
Okay. Any questions or comments from board members at this point? Okay. Then I guess we'll proceed to closing statements. Ms. Bauer-Schmidt?
Thank you very much. First of all, the property owner has supplied an appraisal from a well-qualified independent appraiser who's utilized a cost approach that completely and correctly values the subject property as of January 1st, 2020. Contrary to the allegations of Mr. Hoffman and Ms. Macon, it has no use pact violations. I think Mr. Riley explained exactly how the use and intended users, how it was appropriate the way he used the language. In addition, Ms. O'Brien is here from the company and she authorized the use of this appraisal as well. More importantly, the only independent appraisal evidence is that of the property owner, Mr. Riley's appraisal. The sole reliance that the school board has to retain the county value is a very old decision. The decision that they are relying on is for the 1997 tax year. We are now before the board for the 2020 tax year. It's a couple of owners ago. In addition, with that being said, what the school board did not tell you is the definition of business fixtures has changed in Ohio, and it's changed from this decision. So first of all, that's important. Also, the appraisers use discounted cash flow. We don't utilize that for purposes of valuing
real estate, the Board of Tax Appeals has rejected that use. But what's really kind of interesting is that this decision, while it was from the Board of Tax Appeals, it was appealed to the Supreme Court. And very shortly after this decision, the parties settled it. So they among themselves agreed to some value. I don't have access to that because it's such an old case. But with that being said, very clearly the testimony has shown that the cost approach, well, it was in fact utilized to value this property, and it was prepared by Mr. Hoffman's company, Appraisal Research. That there were some issues regarding that, and well, the buildings, some of those should not have been included because they are machinery and equipment, they're personal property, there's business fixtures. But what we have is an independent appraiser who has actually come in, and you can tell from his testimony, he has appraised numerous power plants throughout the country. He has represented both governmental entities as well as property owners over the last 5 years. And he has come up with a value that clearly shows that as of January 1st, 2020, the subject property was overvalued. Well, we understand the allegation that Ms. Macon made that, oh my goodness, he put it as a continuing use, highest and best use. As of January 1st, 2020, then technically, in a retrospective appraisal, the notice had not been given publicly that this was going to close. So that was an appropriate determination and that Mr. Riley made. Additionally, subsequent to that, we see that there had been 2 announcements. It's not good news for this facility, but I think what's going to be interesting to see going in the future is that we understand the impact that this has on the schools and the county. If in fact the parties would like to reach out, we'd be more than happy to try to come up with some kind of resolution. You know, we understand that that the proper number is much lower than what the actual value is. And we understand the impact that has, and we've been more than happy to sit down with the school board and the county and try to resolve this. Unfortunately, you know, sometimes we have to go through this process so you can actually see what the appraisal evidence shows, and it shows a much lower value. And we respectfully request, contrary to the position of the school board and the county, is the fact that this property is extremely overvalued. We've met our burden of proof. And while we've amended our complaint to conform with the testimony and appraisal of Mr. Riley, we, on behalf of the property owner, I know Emily is shaking her head, we're more than happy to table this to another day, and so that the parties could sit and come to a resolution, because we understand when you're talking this kind of value reduction, it has a disastrous impact. And, you know, we don't want to put that onto the board members or to the school board. And as a result, we respectfully request that you give us time to negotiate, try to come to a resolution. But in any regards, we want to really thank the board. You have taken so much of your time out to talk with us and let us present our case, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you. Mr. Demuzio?
Thank you. Yeah, it's our position that the owner has the burden of proof, and they simply haven't met it here. I think it is important that the board go ahead and rule on that. They had an opportunity, the other side, to come up with a probative report, and they didn't do that. They came up with an approach that has been rejected in the past by the BTA. So I think it's important that we go on record. If there's going to be settlements in the future, that could happen. That could happen as part of the BTA process if the owner decides that they would want to appeal that. Mr. Riley used the Marshall Swift approach, which has been rejected by the BTA. And when you read why they rejected that approach way back 20 years ago, it's clear that it's because power plants are unique. Marshall Swift tries to pick up maybe what a warehouse might cost or an apartment building, but it's difficult for a power plant. There's no power plant designation. They're not picking up all the special costs, and that's why it was rejected. And I think what was appropriate then is still appropriate. This effort to exclude buildings on page 11 As personal property, again, I think the owner does have the obligation of coming up with their personal property records, and that could be easily done. They don't need to show us their entire personal property tax records, but they could show us the page where they list these particular assets. You want to be careful. It is possible that there is equipment that is on these personal property tax records, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the structure that houses that equipment has been categorized and paid paid for in terms of its personal property taxes. So, but I think it could easily be done. They could just show us those pages where they've listed it and what they've listed it as. My understanding is on personal property is the county usually, or I'm sorry, the state usually governs that and decides whether or not the depreciated cost that's listed there is in fact proper. The other big reason why this is not a probative report is they failed to account for the site prep. We know what the 14 million goes for. He told us in his report. It goes for things like paving, fencing, that sort of thing. It doesn't go for the tremendous amount of costs that would go to, that had to be expended to raise this up out of the floodplain. All of the different site prep that goes into preparing a site for a large power plant such as this. The fact that this went to the Supreme Court, that's reflected on the front page I sent you. All that means is the other side appealed. It's a matter of public record what the BTA ruled. I forget the number. I think it was around 188 million. It exceeded the 168 million or so that the county had it on for, and it's a matter of public record. You can go back and look at what it was put on for as part of the settlement. And it was, my recollection was it was put on for the original county value. So there was no effort made to meet the appraisal. My recollection of the appraisal, I think it was 18 or 20 million. I forget the exact number that was being argued by the taxpayer, but there was no effort to go back to that. It was simply an effort to put it back to its original value. This issue of better and more efficient, what I think I said in my earlier arguments was that this plant is a much better and more competitive plant than other coal-fired plants. It was never meant to say it was more efficient than natural gas, plants that use natural gas. So the real question is, how does it stack up against other coal-fired power plants? Many of those have in fact closed. Beckjord closed many years ago, which is also in Clermont County. Zimmer was not closed. Why was it not closed? There could be 100 different reasons, but it was obviously more efficient. And one reason was that it has these scrubbers that can use low-cost coal, so it gave it a competitive advantage over other coal plants that couldn't use that. I mentioned earlier that Mr. Riley's report's also deficient because he uses average coal prices in Ohio in coming up with his economic depreciation. He could simply have asked the company to give him the actual coal costs. That would have been a better, and I think, a more accurate. And certainly if it was lower priced coal, then it would have the effect of increasing the value and reducing the amount of economic depreciation. He should have asked for that apparently and didn't. These continuing property record cards, I found Mr. Riley's explanation a little confusing. He could have asked for the FERC records. I couldn't tell from his testimony whether that historical FERC data actually is in the hands of the new owner. It might not be. He talked about how he could get the new accounting records. Of course, that would not reflect FERC cost data. He's correct. But he could have asked for the historical cost records. I don't know if Duke or Synergy gave those to them or not, but he could have tried to get that, and then he could have trended it upwards. It would not have been useless. It would have been very valuable to know exactly what each component of the plant cost, and then they could simply trend it upwards. Even if it was 2018 data, it could be trended up for a couple of years. I disagree a little bit with Ms. Mahon on one point. I have no problem with valuing it as an operating plant. That's what it was in 2020. The public didn't know that it might be shut down in the future. We've seen how those plans can change. They originally thought 2027, then it was 2022. Maybe it goes back to 2027 next year. We don't know. Economic conditions change. We've seen what's happened in Europe recently. Europe shut down a lot of these plants for pollution reasons, and we know that Europe is scurrying now, trying to find sufficient power that's reliable. And you know, who knows whether that'll happen here. Whether we've cut back too much, I don't know. China is scurrying. They have insufficient power plants right now. They cut back because of COVID, and now they have more demand, and they're having to actually black out certain industries in China because there's insufficient power. So who knows what might happen? It goes up and down. We talked about the rapid increase in natural gas prices, whether that changes any of these scenarios and makes them less efficient. These things change from time to time. So I don't think they've met their burden. I think they could have used accepted methodology that they didn't, and therefore I don't think they have probative evidence, and I'd ask for no reduction.
Board members, and Mr. D'Amuzio, then are you saying in your statements that your position, you're not recognizing any economic obsolescence?
No, I didn't say anything like that.
By recognizing you don't want to change in value, you're saying that you're not recognizing that there could be some economic obsolescence.
No, what I'm saying is the county has done its analysis and has made depreciation. If you look, they've done physical depreciation from what it would cost. Whether or not any additional economic depreciation should come in, or whether or not that existing 140 million, whatever it is accurate today, the other side has the burden of coming up with a probative report that deals with that issue. Just to say there's economic depreciation doesn't mean anything. It might be $10 million, it might be $5 million, it might be $100 million. That burden is on them, and what I'm saying is their report was not accurate. And just to say there's economic depreciation, isn't proper. The other problem, of course, with theirs is they've come up with a much lower reproduction, cost, if you will, than the county has. So again, they're depreciating it from a much lower number than you're depreciating it from. But again, the burden is on them. They would have to show that economic depreciation. And I don't think they've done that with a probative report.
Any other questions or comments from the board? We have a request to table this. Is the board in favor of doing that?
Yeah, I would like to make that motion that we table it. I do feel that that the county has not had the expertise, as Ms. Mayhem has testified, to make some adjustments. And so I would be in favor of tabling it and have the parties try to negotiate, because I do realize the impact on both parties. That's my motion.
I'll second that motion. I agree with what your statement is.
So I have a motion and a second to table this. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carried. So, Mr. Brown? We'll table this for further
Until further
contact
notice,
from the
yes.
parties?
Yes.
Okay. Ms. Bowerschmidt?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all
We
for,
really appreciate it.
thank you all for your time and your testimony.
And your patience.
Thank you for your patience with our recording equipment. And Mr. D'Amuzio, anything?
Are we still on the record?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's appropriate. I think that they have the burden, either they've met the burden or they haven't. They clearly have an insufficient report. We can negotiate if it goes up on appeal. We don't have a report. So it's very difficult. One reason that there have been suggestions before this hearing that maybe we try to, and it's like, what do we do it with? I have a similar, I do a lot of this power plant work. I'm doing stuff up in Gallia County right now for the county. And we had to hire an appraiser. But there, the BOR did make a no reduction. It went to the BTA. But we did go ahead, the county has gone ahead and hired its own expert out of New Hampshire to look at it, to help them come up with a number. It's looking like there's a high likelihood that the appraiser is going to come up with a higher number than the county had gone for to begin with. And that's why I raised the issue I did. It's very difficult. You can't just assume that there's economic depreciation and start deducting it from some number. We don't know if the 140 is the right number. It might be 180. Until we can do that, if what you're saying is you're going to table it, then I guess maybe the school district would have to do something expensive like, get that, or the county could hire an expert if they felt they didn't have the expertise. And that's certainly a possibility, but we haven't done it now because we really have nothing. We have an insufficient report on their side, and we have no expert report of our own. So it makes it very difficult for us to negotiate.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
This concludes this hearing.